Hi guys, welcome to the video lectures on natural selection. We are in Module 2 and this is our third topic. Included in this section will also be not only natural selection but sexual selection. And remember the context of natural selection and sexual selection. These are mechanisms of evolution that we haven't yet talked about. The other ones that we have talked about are mutation, migration, and genetic drift. Natural selection and sexual selection are the other two. They're sort of more important. They typically get more credit for how evolution happens, so I wanted to make sure I gave them a separate topic. So here's how this is going to work. I'm going to go over some terminology. I'm going to talk about the three conditions for natural selection, and then clear up a few misconceptions about natural selection. Then we will talk about an example, Galapagos finches, which I'm sure you have all heard about in terms of the Galapagos Islands and all the cool species they have there. And then we are going to end on a quick introduction to sexual selection. So in terms of terminology, there's going to be a lot of terms that I'll be using during this lecture and that you will be seeing in your reading and in the activities that you have in this topic. So let's go through some of them. In general, natural selection is when individuals who are best able to survive and reproduce end up passing on more of their genes to the next generation, and this results in evolution. Remember that evolution is simply a change in genetic makeup in a population over time. Remember that when I say the word evolution, I'm almost always referring to microevolution, so short-term changes in genetic makeup or in allele frequencies. Variation, this is a pretty obvious one. Variation just means that there's multiple versions of particular traits. Variation is usually attributed to different alleles for particular traits if the variation we're seeing is genetic variation. And genetic variation is what's most important in terms of natural selection and evolution. Adaptation. Adaptation is any trait that increases someone's survival or reproduction. And any adaptation is going to increase fitness. Fitness is a term that's not really as obvious as some of these others. Fitness, in terms of biology, means the relative number of offspring that an individual produces. So fitness is relative to other individuals in that same population. For example, my sister has 5 children, and I have 2 children, so she has greater fitness than I do. And so we're talking about 2 individual humans in the same population. If I were to just say fitness is the number of offspring, that can kind of work. But if I said, okay, this beetle mother had 100 offspring, you might think, oh, that fitness is really high. But that fitness is actually really low if the average number of offspring for other beetles is 500. So just remember that fitness is a relative term, but it relates to the number of offspring that an individual has. And fitness is really the goal of natural selection, basically maximizing the number of offspring you can have. So how does evolution by natural selection work? There are 3 principles or conditions that have to be met for natural selection to work in the way that we understand it. First of all, the population must start out with variation. Okay? If you have no variation in a population, everyone's identical, they're all clones, then there's no raw material for natural selection to act upon. So you have to start out with variation. And remember that all variation comes from the accumulation of mutations over thousands or millions of years. Okay, so populations have to have variation in their traits. For natural selection to work, that variation must have a genetic or heritable component to it. So whatever that variation is, it gets passed on to offspring. So this little figure right here is showing variation. There's, in this image, there are 3 tan beetles and 3 green beetles. This heredity or this heritable component is showing that there's little different chromosomes that are attributing the colors to the different beetles. So this one has 2 green alleles, this one has 1 green allele, 1 tan allele, this one has 2 tan alleles, etc. Okay, so that just means that this color, this is showing that this color is heritable because the alleles are within the genetic makeup of the beetles. And the third component, or the third condition, is that there has to be selection on the variation. What that means is that some individuals have an advantage to the others. And we're talking specifically about the trait in question where there was the variation that we initially mentioned. So the selection means that there is either differential survival or reproduction based on that trait that we were looking at. If you look at this figure right here, you can see that there is a bird seems to be picking off the green individuals, maybe because they show up more. They're not camouflaged onto this background, and so these green ones don't survive as well as the tan ones, and therefore they don't reproduce as well either. So then the end result is going to be evolution. The next generation will look different from the original generation or the original population. So here we have the original population with green beetles and tan beetles. After selection occurs, a lot of the green beetles get eaten, and the resulting population has a lot fewer green beetles than tan ones. So now I'm going to demonstrate how to simulate natural selection using this program called EvoDots, and I will be right back with that. Okay, so here is the EvoDots program that I was telling you about, and this is just a brief simulation of how natural selection works. So here we have 50 different dots of different colors. You can see here, here's what the original population looks like. The speed of the dots is variable. We have it selected that the speed is actually heritable, so if these dots were to reproduce, their offspring would have the same speed as they do. And survival is selective, so you'll see what all that means in just a second. So I have this new population here, and what's going to happen is I'm going to act as a predator. I'm going to click on the individual dots that I'm eating, and we'll just see how it turns out. I'm going to stop. There's 50 to begin with. I'm going to stop after I've eaten 25 and see how it goes. So I'm actually trying to find the ones now that I can tell are moving kind of slow because they're easier to get. Okay, so I got to 25, and this is the remaining population. So if I reproduce now, but you can see the distribution of this original population where there were some black ones, and now there's no black ones or purple ones. And the reason is presumably because those black ones and purple ones were slow. Okay, so that's if variability, the variability in traits is selected, heritability, meaning they pass it down to their offspring, and that being slow means that you don't survive, or being the different color means you're more likely to get eaten. So let's unselect variability and see what happens. Make a new population. Okay, so what happens is when I take out variability, everybody is green. Okay, so I'm going to rerun the populations, rerun the simulation, see what happens. Okay, I'm also going to stop when I get to 25. Okay, so I'm stopping there. You can see that the beginning population has this sort of genetic makeup or variation. This one has this variation. It's identical. Let's reproduce, see what happens. Nothing happens. Okay, so there's no evolution. There's no change in allele frequency or change in genetic makeup over time. So I'm going to click variable again, and then I'm going to take out heritable. So let's see what happens when we do that. I'm going to make a new population. We've got the variation back again. And what we don't have is that it's not heritable. So I'm going to run the simulation, see what happens. Okay, I'm at 25. Okay, so after I have basically eaten, looks like I ate most of all the black ones and all the purple ones and a lot of the blue ones. You can see the distribution has changed a lot based on which ones I eliminated by clicking on them. But remember, heritability is not selected, so let's see what happens when we reproduce. Okay, so when we reproduce, some of the black ones came back, some of the purple ones came back, and a lot of this distribution doesn't look all that different from the original one. So you can see that evolution doesn't really work in the same way if the trait that you're selecting for is not heritable. So let's click heritable again and get rid of selective. So I think what this one is going to do is, well, I don't actually remember what it's going to do. So let's see what happens. It doesn't look like the ones that I'm actually, whoa, stop. The ones that I was clicking were not the ones that were disappearing. So I was not able to select them based on any kind of trait. So selection was kind of random. So here we have the original population. Here we have the resulting population and what happens if we reproduce. Okay, so you can see that there's no real change, not a significant change, certainly not the same type of change there was when traits were variable, heritable, and selective. Okay, so remember that the three main conditions for natural selection to occur are that there is variation in traits, that the variation is heritable, so passed down from parents to offspring, and that there is selection on those traits that makes some individuals more likely to survive and reproduce. So I'm going to tell you, give you some ideas of some really common misconceptions in natural selection that don't take into account these conditions that I was just talking to you about. So a lot of times people will define natural selection as survival of the fittest. This is problematic in several different ways because we know that fitness in terms of biology means whoever has the most offspring, and survival of the ones that have the most offspring doesn't really make a lot of sense. Also, sometimes people think survival of the fittest means the one who's the biggest or the most or the strongest is the one that's going to do the best in terms of natural selection. That's not always the case. So if we look at this example, we've got the Hall of Fame, who's the most fit in terms of natural selection. I'm Finns, I'm fit because I'm the biggest. I'm Jim Bob, I win since I have the most babies. I'm Speedo, I win because I swim the fastest. I'm Romeo, I win since I mated with the most females. So who do you think actually wins in terms of natural selection? The biggest, the fastest, the one who mated with the most females, or the ones who had the most babies? The answer is B, Jim Bob. He wins because he had the most babies. Doesn't matter if he's fast, doesn't matter if he mated with a whole bunch of individuals, doesn't matter if he's the biggest. If he passes on the most genes to the next generation, he is the winner in terms of natural selection. So you can see why survival of the fittest doesn't really explain what's going on with natural selection. Another thing that people often say when they're talking about natural selection or when they're thinking about natural selection is that under certain conditions, an animal tries to get a certain mutation or starts to behave in a particular way, and they get an adaptation. that is not the way it works. So adaptation doesn't involve trying. The traits that natural selection acts upon are random. They're randomly produced through mutation. And this one kind of gets to this a little bit more. You don't get a mutation because you need it. Natural selection acts on the variation that's already there. So what happens when a species needs a mutation and they don't have it? The species goes extinct. That's what happens. Okay? They don't get a mutation because they need it to survive. So that's where I'm going to end the first video for this topic. And the next video will be giving you a real-life example of natural selection with the Galapagos finches.